know that 50% of people will experience a mental health disorder, whether it be anxiety or depression, by the age of 75? Yes, that's quite a large statistic, and I suggest it's not fully encompassing of everyone that actually, it's only those that report it, obviously. So, and this was a result of a study. And yes, you've actually landed on the Me and My Health Up podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Hartcher. I'm a clinical nutritionist and lifestyle medicine specialist. The purpose of this podcast is to enhance and enlighten your well-being. And today's topic is the neuroscience of depression and how you can beat the blues. And I read this study from the Queensland University, and it was a very comprehensive study, 150,000 people across 23 countries, conducted over 2 decades, and they found that 50% of people will encounter a mental health disorder by the age of 75. And the most common being anxiety and depression. I've covered anxiety, the neuroscience of anxiety, and how you can unravel it in a previous episode. So today we're talking about the neuroscience of depression and how you can beat the blues. So let's start with, is that a real statistic? Well, I think it's probably understated, and I think you'll find that majority of people, well, certainly they found 50%, but I think it's greater because some people don't report, and some people are unaware. I've spoken to friends that were unaware that they were depressed, okay? And I was unaware that I was experiencing anxiety. I just had these physiological responses in certain situations that I didn't know it was anxiety. I just thought I'm getting a bit hot and feeling a bit uncomfortable, but I don't know what it is. Something's taking control of me. And yes, it was anxiety. So, and I didn't report that. So we all experience it, and it's not a disease. It's medically called it a disorder. But yes, you are essentially, there's a disorder in the body, disorder in the mind, which expresses itself physically, and have a disordered mind, disordered body. And yes, you can bring it back into order. And that's what we're going to be talking today about, how to bring it back in order. But first of all, we've got to explore the neuroscience of depression. So what they've found now is that it's not a chemical imbalance. So that's been proven wrong. And that was a theory that was running for many decades, and drug companies jumped on the back of that and produced lots of antidepressants, which are commonly known as SSRIs, which is the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it keeps the serotonin sitting around the synapses between neurons, and that creates or helps prevent the imbalance or the low serotonin. And what it does create is too much serotonin, okay? So then it creates issues and side effects as a result of too much serotonin. So our body has been designed to find homeostasis, and the mind is looking to find that homeostasis. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. As much as our body is always working to restore homeostasis, that balanced state, our mind is also looking to reestablish that balanced state. So what causes depression? Well, depression is in itself a neurological issue associated with expectations being too high versus the reality of the situation. So that distortion between expectations and your reality can make you feel that you're hopeless or life's pointless, or I really can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, because your expectations are so big that they are unrealistic and essentially a fantasy, and the reality around you is so far from it. And as much as that seems very simplistic, it is a reality. I see it time and time again with my clients around unrealistic expectations of self and others. So let's explore this a bit further. So the unrealistic expectation of self is comparing yourself to someone else. So I can relate to that in terms of my karate experience. You can look at your sensei or your master of karate that's showing how things should be done, or what's a good example of how to do this, and you look at it and think, wow, if only I could be that good. And then expecting yourself to be there within a year, and these masters of karate have spent decades working to perfect their art. And so it's an unrealistic expectation of self to think that you should be there within a year or two, or to be as good as that person within a year or two. And people often, make that comparison in terms of wealth. So they look at people that have, achieved massive amounts or accumulated massive amounts of financial wealth. And, like, for example, you could say, well, how come I can't have, I want the wealth of Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's in his 90s now, and he's made the majority, or certainly something like over 90% of his wealth over the age of 75. And so if you haven't been around that long, how can you expect, and he's been a fantastic manager of money, so he's certainly mastered the art of managing money. And how can you compare yourself to, expecting to have what Warren Buffett's achieved by not having the years and not having that, that intellect in terms of how he's trained himself and taught himself around managing money. So they're really unrealistic expectations. And some people have this around beauty. For example, they're comparing themselves to someone else's body and thinking, I want that on this person, and I want this sort of look from this person. And they've got a mismatch of all these people that they've created this illusion of who they want to be. And it's far from reality. And they have this unrealistic expectation of self that they'll become this illusion of this person that they've created in their mind, but which is a lot different to the reality. And so part of what I wanted to go through today is how can you bring order to that disordered thinking? And so when you have the unrealistic expectations of self around career, for example, wanting to achieve a certain milestone within a career because someone else has achieved it within that time frame, well, they could have had circumstances align perfectly for them, and they had a really smooth path towards that, and a bit of luck that came into that rise up the ladder, so to speak. And you might be more challenged along your journey, or you might have different priorities, which is most likely the reason why you're not achieving it as quickly as them. Their highest priority is most likely their career. And so other things become second to their career, and they put a lot of energy, attention, and focus into their career, and hence they achieve success in their career. Whereas you might sort of dream to have that successful career, but you want everything else as well. And so that's not realistic in terms of you might not value the career as much as they do, and you've got other values or other things that are important and high priority to you, and you put your energy and attention into those areas, well, you're not going to achieve it as quickly, that career. You're not going to have that rapid career ascension, okay? So it's important to get real with your expectations as to, well, for example, I could say this podcast, right? I'd love to be overnight, I'd love to achieve the success of Joe Rogan. It would be great, but I think what I'm enjoying is the journey. I'm enjoying learning and working out ways in which I can share that learning to you and the people I meet along that journey, and hearing the stories back from the listeners as to how much of a difference it's making in their lives. That's very fulfilling to me. And I'm on a mission to become the best version of me, to become the best, I guess what I want to achieve in terms of imparting wisdom onto you and helping you be the best version of yourself through education. And that's success for me. And as Earl Nightingale said, that success is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. Well, my worthy ideal is to enhance and enlighten the well-being of others. And I can see evidence that that's coming true through the feedback I get through the listeners, and also the podcast guests that I interview. They say that I'm a good interviewer because I listen, and I'm looking to extract maximum value to my listeners. So, and that's because I'm on mission. I'm not here just to chase numbers. I'm not just looking at the numbers every day. Like, the numbers give me some feedback as to whether I'm creating engaging content. So that's important. And I seek feedback from you in order to, but I get fulfillment through just sharing my wisdom and learning from others. So I've learned a lot on my journey of being the host of this podcast by interviewing others and learning from their area of expertise. And so my health's improved. And I'm hoping as a consequence of that, your health is improving too. And the difference would only be that if you're putting into action. So I certainly put what I learn into action, and I'm hoping you're doing the same, because you'd certainly get good outcomes. So having realistic expectations of self, and then looking for, ways to measure. So it's setting realistic goals and then you've got tangible measures, and so that you can measure the progress towards that goal, and then getting away from the comparison of others, because that comparison of others is that they've got different goals, they've got different priorities, and their order of priorities is going to be different to your order of priorities. And based on where your attention goes, your energy flows, and that's where you're going to get success. So wherever you're putting your most attention to, that's where you're going to start to see the manifestation of success in those areas that you're putting your energy towards. So I'm putting my energy towards enhancing and enlightening the well-being of others, and I'm starting to realize that progressive realization of a worthy ideal in terms of the numbers. The numbers they're growing over time steadily, which is fantastic. I'm making progress. And so I don't create this unrealistic expectation that I'm going to be Joe Rogan within 5 years or 10 years. And at the end of the day, I want to be the best version of myself. I don't want to be another Joe Rogan, because I'll only be the second best version of him. I'm not him. Okay. So getting realistic with your goals, and making sure you've got some measures in place and I often see this with weight loss. So weight loss people, want to lose it quickly. They want to just get quick weight loss. They want quick wins, essentially, and they're looking for that quick result, or that pill that's going to give them the fast result. And what I find is they then adopt unsustainable behaviors, which they do for a period of time. They get some results, but they can't sustain them. So they go back to the old way of doing things, because they get sick of what they changed to, and it's too extreme. So I think it's best to find that middle road for you and measure yourself on how you're going towards your progress towards that goal. So I measure myself by my daily actions. So I have a goal to at least record 3 hours of podcast content every month. That's my goal. And I'm working towards that goal every month. And that's how I can release an episode every week. And so I have a goal around making sure I have a edited version of an episode every week. And I'm looking for guests that would be appropriate, and I'm knocking back the ones that aren't appropriate. And I'm looking for what's going to be best value for you, because this is ultimately for you. Obviously, I do benefit in the process. I'm educating myself, and I'm getting better around my health, but I want to take you along for the journey. So setting up those realistic expectations of self, and then measuring yourself against so not comparing yourself to someone else, measuring you against what you set as daily actions that you will do in order to get that goal. So my daily action around this podcast is to research, is to get educated in all aspects of health and well-being. And in particular, I have a focus on neuroscience, hence why I'm bringing a neuroscience to the table. So this unrealistic expectation of self, which is a fantasy of illusion of who you want to be, that it's not the real you. Get real, set realistic goals, and then measure yourself against your daily actions towards that goal, and don't compare yourself to someone else, because they have different priorities, different importance in terms of what they value. So let them be the best version of you, and you be the best version of yourself. Now that brings me to the next point, is unrealistic expectation of others. So expecting others to be like you. And so this is, again, pointless, because they're completely unique and special. And in order for them to be the best versions of themselves, they need to be themselves, just like you're being the best version of you. So letting others be the best version of themselves. And I see this with parents wanting children to be like them and behave like them, but the kids can't live up to the parents' expectations because they're unrealistic. The kids are unique and special, and they've been brought into this world with unique superpowers, and we should be encouraging them to pursue their superpowers. And so my superpower was around health education, and I'm in pursuit of constantly mastering or finessing that art of health education and finding ways in which I can articulate the message to you so that it's empowering to you, so I don't lose you, okay? So I'm looking at ways in which I can improve the podcast and my communication to you and how I use examples, and to stay on track, of course. So unrealistic expectations of others, it could be of your partner. So expecting your partner to do it the way you do things. And if they don't, then they've done it wrong and they're hopeless, and you're looking down on them, and they feel that, I can't live up to your expectations. They're not succeeding, or they're not moving forward. They're not progressing because they can't please you. And so this is another issue, is when you expect them to know that they've let you down because you've expressed that to them, and they're always going to let you down because they're not you. Okay. So again, that is really unrealistic expectation on others. And then continuing to hold this illusion that people will be like you is making you feel, thinking that, the world's not, and that people aren't behaving like me, and therefore they're hopeless. And then you start to question yourself as to whether you're the issue, and you start to, look down at yourself and become very self-critical. Okay. And one of the things that they've found in terms of the links to depression is, well, first of all, it's a heterogeneous, multifactorial issue or disorder, depression. It's not just one cause and effect. It's not just low serotonin. There's a multitude of factors that can lead to depression. And one of them is being overly self-critical. And that over self-criticalness can come as a result of realizing that people can't live up to your expectations and that everyone lets you down. Okay. So your perception is that everyone's letting you down. They're just trying to please you, but they can't because they're not you. Okay. Because you want them to do it the way you do it, which is insanity, really. It's totally unreal. So, parents really need to let go and let children be the best versions of themselves, and to support their superpowers, allow them to flourish in the areas that are important to them, that they value, and to encourage them to invest time and energy and to do well, as opposed to, comparing your children to other. And this is the other thing, parents will also compare their children to other children. And that is, pointless, because your children have a complete different genetic makeup and a complete different upbringing, and the parents are different. And so the parents have different values, and they're imposing those values on their children so that they're going to be different. And some children may be allowed to pursue what's important to them, and so they're succeeding because it's highly valuable to them, and they're investing a lot of attention and energy into that area, and so they're going to succeed in that area. You might not value what that kid is, you want the success, okay? But if it's not a value to you, you're not going to impose that value onto your kids, and your kids aren't putting the same time and energy into that activity. So this self-criticalness is then, looking at yourself and thinking, well, everyone's letting me down, and they're not. And then the other thing is when you set unrealistic expectations on yourself, you think you're letting yourself down, but they're just unrealistic expectations. You have a disillusion as to what is realistic. Okay. So get realistic, and then set daily actions that will take you into the direction that's important to you. So first of all, it's got to be an area that's really important to you. Like, this is really important to me, so I don't need to motivate myself to do the research around the podcasting because it's important to me. It's meaningful to me. I really get inspired when I'm learning about it, and I love sharing it. So that's one aspect of depression, is unrealistic expectations on self, others, or unrealistic expectations of life versus the reality. So the wider the gap, the larger the gap, the greater you feel disillusioned with life. So if there's a large gap between your reality and how you expect the world to be, the larger that gap, the more you're going to feel let down by the world and your reality that you're perceiving. Okay, so you can narrow that gap by dropping the unrealistic expectations on self and others and the world and get real. And that will help lower that and shorten that gap. And then the reality will get closer towards what is real. So I set realistic goals, and I'm not in this illusion that, I'm going to be Joe Rogan overnight. Okay. And I actually don't want to be Joe Rogan. I just want to be the best version of myself. However, I do want to grow the podcast because that helps me fulfill my mission, which is to enhance and enlighten the well-being of others. So the more people I get that out to, the more I'm realizing that vision. But I'm really realizing that vision every day because I get more and more listeners. The listeners are growing, they're not declining. So I'm progressing towards that realization of a worthy ideal. So that's one aspect. The other aspect I want to cover, and we talked about it in the episode of Neuroscience of Anxiety. So prolonged anxiety. So prolonged anxiety can influence a depressive disorder. So you're feeling consciously anxious for long periods of time. So constantly feeling stuck, uncertain for long periods of time, you lose hope. And that loss of hope then results in that depression feeling. Your moods are down because you lose hope. Okay, so prolonged anxiety, and what can cause prolonged anxiety is chronic stress. And so chronic stress is correlated with depression as well. And so that chronic stress can be driven from too much challenge and not enough support. So the greater the gap between challenge and support, the greater that gap is distress. And so what can we do to narrow that gap, to narrow the distress so that it becomes eustress? And ultimately, eustress is formed when we have challenge meeting support. So when those two meet, then we have eustress. That is good for us. That's when we're growing, okay? When we have that greater gap between the challenge and support, that's distressful, and that's when we essentially degrade. We put ourselves down. We think we're no good. We're hopeless, okay? Because you feel like you're banging your head against the brick wall and going nowhere, essentially. That's what's happening. You feel stuck, okay? And the longer you feel stuck, the more you feel hopeless, and the more you lose that life in you. Life becomes pointless. What's the point? I go nowhere. No matter what I do, this is all around me all the time, and it's frustrating. And so that can result in depression long term if you have that prolonged stress. And so what can you do? You can reduce the challenges so you can take on less. As I said, you can lower your expectations. That will help lower the challenges. Some challenges will remain, and if they're linked to a value of yours, then they're probably going to be perceived less as a challenge, as just something that's on the way to achieving success. Whereas if you're pursuing something that's not of value to you, then you're going to see it as in the way and just feel like you just keep running into it, essentially. And you get frustrated, but you're not willing to master it and get on top of it because it's not important to you. And so maybe it's to let go of that challenge, or to focus on what's important to you and take on challenges that fulfill you. So the challenge for me is constantly coming up with new content and ideas and things that I can educate you in, and new guests. So that's a challenge for me, but I like that challenge. I like looking at what's trending and what are people looking up, searching, and then I'm thinking, yeah, I can educate people on that. I can help them on that. So let's create an episode around it. So let's either look at the challenge and see whether it's worthy. If it's a challenge that is there and you're not coping, for example, a challenge such as you've recently experienced a loss of a loved one, so that can be really challenging. So then you might be wanting to look at, well, that challenge is not going to go away, right? It's there. What can I do? I can bring the support up. So you can reach out for support. You can get support in this area. You can get counseling. You can see a psychologist. You can see a professional that helps people that move through grief and trauma. So you can then reach out for support, and that brings the support up and narrows the gap, which reduces the distress. So we want to narrow the gap between challenge and support, get them to meet one another, and that creates eustress. That's when you are essentially, there's enough challenge, but enough support to meet the challenge, and you're growing as a person. And that's like this podcast. I don't have realistic expectations of this podcast. I just do daily actions towards making this better. And that's me. And I see that through the numbers that I can tell my daily actions are being fruitful, that are actually delivering results through the actions. And yes, they might not be where I want them to be, but how do I know where they should be? I don't really know. It's a bit like that weight loss target. You think, well, I want to lose 5 kilos, but why 5 kilos? And there's generally some association with when I was that weight, I was on top of the world. So it's more the associative effects. So maybe if you got on top of the world, you wouldn't need to lose the 5 kilos. Okay. So again, it's, asking yourself why, and why is that important to you, and really getting to the underlying driver as to why you need to achieve that target. So that's the other aspect I wanted to cover around depression, in terms of what you can do about it, in terms of what's happening in the brain when we have these unrealistic expectations of self or others, or we have a challenge that's far greater than the support. What the brain does is it goes into survival mode. Essentially, it's thinking, well, I'm so challenged and my life's at threat here. It just goes into a primitive mode of survival. That's our midbrain. So that's essentially our midbrain. It's a midbrain area, which is where our amygdala is, the fear center. So the amygdala runs the midbrain when we're in this fight or flight or freeing response, which is a survival response. So it's a response to get away from a predator or to catch prey. And then we've got a stronger desire to get away from a predator, because if you think about it, that predator is an absolute threat on our life in that moment. Whereas if we miss that prey, we're not going to die in that moment. So we have a stronger instinct to get away from a threat than we have an impulse towards something. That's why they say that we have a stronger desire to avoid pain, which is to get away from that threat, that life threat, and then a stronger impulse to, that's much stronger than the impulse towards something. We're more likely to avoid pain than seek pleasure. That's hardwired into us to be that way, because that tiger is a threat in that moment to our life, and we might die in that moment, right? And that's it. That's like game over, so to speak. Whereas you missing that prey or not getting that chocolate bar is not going to be life-threatening in that moment. Maybe if you didn't eat for weeks and weeks and months, then that becomes a big problem, because you start to fall apart and start to break down, and you're getting closer to death the longer you go without eating. But you can miss plenty of times of capturing that prey versus the need to get away, that instinctual need to get away from that pain or that threat, that life threat. So this is that amygdala in our brain, the fear center. It's more responsive to threat to our life, okay? And so that amygdala is wanting you to survive, essentially. And so it's going to help you get away from something. So what does it do? It then changes the neurochemistry in the brain. So instead of telling you that, oh, life's good and all those pleasurable sort of neurotransmitters, so it's going to produce less of them. So the ones that are associated with good mood and feeling upbeat, such as dopamine and serotonin, they're ones you've probably heard about. So, serotonin is often associated with the smiley emoji. Dopamine is probably associated with, winning and feeling elated and on top of the world, and I want more of this. It's that reward seeking neurotransmitter. So those two neurotransmitters are going to be, mind's going to make less of them, because it's life threatening. We don't need to feel happy. We don't want to feel content. Okay. And we haven't achieved an award yet. Okay. Mate, the dopamine will go up after you get away from that threat, right? And same with the serotonin. But whilst that threat is there, your brain is down regulating the serotonin, is down regulating the dopamine, because they're not essential for that getting away from that threat in that moment. You're perceiving a lot more negative, and so you should, because it's life threatening. So what the body then does is create neurotransmitters associated with getting you away from that threat or towards the pleasure. Okay. And these are adrenaline and epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so our body produces more of them, which have a physiological response in our body. And part of that physiological response is the production of cortisol from the kidneys, right? So our kidneys produce the cortisol when it's signaled from the brain to produce cortisol. And that's part of the stress response to the body. So we have a stress response in the brain, which is norepinephrine. And again, they're stressed. So they're taking us wanting to just see one side, essentially, that only that side is freedom. That side is death. Okay. And so we have a really imbalanced perspective towards one side. We have a confirmation bias. We just see all the negatives and we don't see the positives. And that's to get us to run the opposite direction. It's to get us away from something. And once we get away from that thing, then our neurochemistry will change. Okay. It will change to say, oh, you can feel content now. You're safe. Okay. I'll start producing some serotonin. I don't need the epinephrine or norepinephrine neurotransmitters. I'll downregulate them. And yes, I'll give you some dopamine to say, well done, Anthony. You got away from that threat. And I'll make sure I encourage that amount of activity and the way you ran and course you took. And I'll make sure I store that in memory. I'll store that in the hippocampus as this is the path to take when this sort of threat arises. Okay. And so this is how our brain is, how the brain's chemistry is changing based on our perceptions of reality. And so if you perceive a challenge way too bigger, so it becomes a threat to your life, right? There's just too much to handle and not enough support. So the support, if you have too much support, you're producing lots of serotonin, okay, and oxytocin. They're neurotransmitters associated with feeling content around support and feeling loved and connected. So you're going to produce them when you have high amounts of support. And too much of them is not good either, because we get too content, too complacent, and we don't do things that challenge us and inspire us, and we get bored, and we end up just eating, and we overeat, and we just relax and watch Netflix. We become prey, don't we? Because we put on too much weight, and then we become a prey to a predator. So, and the predator in this case is our own mind, where we start self-sabotaging ourselves. How did you let yourself get like this, Anthony? That's terrible. You should do that. And anyway, so this is the imbalance on the other perspective. So again, our brain knows how to rebalance itself, provided we shift and alter our perceptions, and we can change the perceptions. If it's not a tiger there, and we're just perceiving a tiger being there, we can say, well, how is this event serving me? How is it benefiting me? So that you're not seeing, you don't have this confirmation bias to the negative. You're then bringing what's currently unconscious, the positives, you're bringing that to the surface by asking yourself, how is it benefiting you? How is this challenge benefiting you and what's important to you? So then you can change your perception of the challenge too, right? And that will alter the neurochemistry, because it will calm the emotions. And you think, okay, it's not all negative. There is some positives with this challenge. So you can change your perception of the challenge. So if you can't remove the challenge, then you can change the perception of that challenge so that it's not hardwired to produce the neurochemistry of stress hormones, because you're not perceiving it as life-threatening. You see the order in it. You see how it is serving you. You see the benefits. You're bringing to your conscious awareness the positives, and they're unconscious initially when you perceive all negative, right? Or more negatives than positives. And that ratio of perception will determine how emotional you are and how distraught you are. So if you perceive way more negatives than positives, then you're going to be a lot more emotional and upset about the situation. You can shift that perception by asking yourself that question. However, it can be challenging to ask yourself that question when the ratios are so oriented towards the negative. You just see it's just all or nothing. You are really strong in your, like, all the blood glucose and oxygen are going to that midbrain, that animal part of the brain that I talked about in the previous episode on anxiety. So that part of the brain, that hardwired brain to get away from the threat, so that's running hard to produce the neurotransmitters associated with stress, okay? And so might be required in that moment is to actually calm yourself through regulating the breathing. And I went through that in the previous episode on anxiety, how you can take control of your breath, calm your emotions, and then be able to access that prefrontal cortex, which I spoke about in the previous episode, about how, because we need to access that area, the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive function, which is in charge of that strategic planning, having that vision. Like, so you actually have a clear vision of what you want, and you can actually see yourself achieving that, okay? And you can only access that when you have blood glucose and oxygen going to that area. And in that moment, when having so much, you're feeling, massive heart palpitations and huge amounts of sweat, then it might be very difficult to then. So one way in which you can orientate the blood flow and get the oxygen and the glucose to that prefrontal cortex and switch that back on, because when we're depressed or we're chronically depressed, there's very little oxygen and blood glucose going to that area of the brain, and the wires actually start getting pruned, so to speak. Our brain starts trimming them because it thinks, well, it's unnecessary. I need to have more focus on getting you, keeping you alive. And so the neurochemistry, as well as the neural wiring of your brain, gets really strong, hardwired, associated with survival. It's all about survival. And that's when you get stuck in this all or nothing thinking. I've got to have this. I have to have this. I must desire this. And this is the other area of the brain that's been associated with depression, is the nucleus accumbens, right? So this is also in that midbrain area, which is where the amygdala is and the hippocampus is this nucleus accumbens. And that is associated with that reward, okay? And that reward and motivation center. And that really reward and motivation center can be how someone then seeks to get immediate fulfilled externally through addictions, right? So the dopamine's down and there's the desire to lift yourself up and to make you feel better, to change that neurochemistry. But instead of looking inwards and self-reflecting and changing it through changing your perceptions, then the person looks outside and goes to an addiction such as alcohol or gambling or drugs to change the neurochemistry of the brain, okay? Or it could be a shopping addiction, okay? So you can get a dopamine hit from shopping. And that nucleus accumbens area is really active when we are getting that reward and we're satisfying that reward and we get more motivated to get that reward. Okay, it's very much a survival thing, thinking, well, yeah, you got that honey. You need to find more of these honeys because that's a pot of gold, that honey, because it's got lots of glucose, and glucose is the primary fuel for the body. It is the easiest fuel to burn. And you can obviously perform better operating on glucose, provided you don't do it in excess. So I just wanted to cover off some other areas that are associated with depression and really changing this neural wiring in our brain. So I've spoken a lot about how we can have an illusion and disillusion with reality, or lose touch with reality because of our unrealistic expectations of self and on others, and then not being able to deal with the challenges because you've got that gap between challenge and support. And again, we can change our perceptions of both and reorient our goals to be realistic, and we can set realistic measures, daily activities, realistic. So it would be unrealistic for me to say, Anthony, to do 8 hours of podcasting in a day. That is really tiring, and I probably wouldn't be doing a good job by the end episode. So typically, if I'm going to do a podcast, it's 1 per day, a maximum of 2 per day. I realize that's where I get optimal output in terms of me being, very alert, switched on, and being able to share the message succinctly, hopefully, and coherently. Whereas if I went on for 8 hours, you can imagine that last episode, who would want to listen to it? Okay. So I set realistic expectations around that daily activity associated with podcasting. And you should too, around your meaningful goal. See, the goals have got to be meaningful, and therefore the challenge is a meaningful challenge. Otherwise, who wants to take on a challenge that is not meaningful to you? So I only take on challenges that are really meaningful to me, that are really high value to me, because that's the area I want to grow in. Whereas if you're setting yourself, or you have a challenge, is an area that doesn't inspire you, then you're going to see it as a glass ceiling. You don't want to break through it. It's just not worthy of. And this is New Year's resolution goals, okay? So they're typically the New Year's resolution goals where you want to just copy someone else and think, oh, I wouldn't mind that success. I'll do that program or that challenge. And then it's not really you. It's not a goal that's meaningful for you. Okay. And then you beat yourself up. You become self-critical, which is also associated with depression. The other things associated with depression is also the lack of sleep. So sleep deprivation. So sleep deprivation then takes us more into that survival thinking, because when we're sleep deprived, we're just trying to get through the day. We can just, with the minimal resources, we're not replenished, we're not fully repaired. And it's a survival way of which we just got to get through the day, okay, until you can get some sleep, until you can get some rest. So the body then goes, and the neurochemistry changes more from that survival, such as more stress hormones are produced to get you through, because the body hasn't adequately repaired, and it's just got to push through the day. So again, it takes the blood, glucose, and oxygen away from the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is also associated with self-regulation, okay? It is where we have governance over our emotions. We quieten down that amygdala that I've spoken about. We quieten down that nucleus accumbens. And that nucleus accumbens is that desire thing, that thing where you seek pleasure, okay, and you want the reward, and you're heavily motivated to do that. That's survival mechanism. So we quieten down that area of the brain when we have blood, glucose, and oxygen going to the prefrontal cortex. We have less going there when we're sleep deprived. Okay, it's because it's more survival. It's just to get you through. We go into that survival mentality, and again, you're going to go towards more higher calorific foods to help you get through the desire, because the nucleus accumbens is taking over. It's saying, yeah, that is looking awesome. That's really going to be helpful for your survival, is that highly calorific food. And yes, it is helpful for survival. When you're in the desert and there's no food, and then you see that highly calorific food, you're going to eat as much as you want, because you don't know when the next meal comes. And when we're in that part of the brain, we have that scarcity mentality, that all or nothing. It's all about survival, okay? So having a good night's sleep can really help in terms of staying on top of that, and having control over your desire center, or your limbic system. And that's, as I said, is the animal center, the survival center. So getting that good night's sleep is important. I've covered that in plenty of previous episodes. Also, that's also very important is nourishment, making sure your body's getting adequate nourishment to be able to produce the neurotransmitters, okay? So if the body doesn't have the resources to manufacture those neurotransmitters and to be able to make the serotonin, to be able to make the dopamine and things like that. So if you're protein deficient, that's the backbone of these neurotransmitters. We need to have adequate protein. We need to have the cofactors that support the manufacture of that neurotransmitter. So cofactors such as the micronutrients, such as we hear as magnesium and zinc, and we need to have iron. We need to have vitamin C is important, and so all these micronutrients are important in small doses, micro dosages, but we need to get the macros right. And so also we need to have the good polyunsaturated fats. So omega-3 has been associated with healthy brain. Also making sure you've got the protein I mentioned, making sure you have adequate zinc in your diet, adequate magnesium. Magnesium comes from leafy greens. So you need this well-balanced diet. So if I look at all the essentials, vitamin D is also linked to a good mental health. So vitamin D our body needs the sun to manufacture vitamin D, but it also needs cholesterol. So we need a balance of everything. And so a balanced diet really helps have a balanced mind. And then I want to get on to exercise. So exercise helps us balance our neurochemistry, because when we're feeling down and we do some activity, it lifts us up. Okay. So we feel high. We get that sense because we produce endorphins when we do activities. So it can really lift our moods and help balance the neurochemistry. So that is really important. Breathing is really important. So dysregulated breathing will create disorder in the mind. Okay, because if you have disordered breathing, it's saying there's something not right. There's something not right happening. I'm responding, and it's not right, and so therefore your brain gets worried about what feedback is coming from the body. So it's important to regulate your breathing and to make sure you breathing in a way that's coherent, which is an equal in-breath and out-breath. And I covered that in the previous episode of anxiety. So I've covered a lot today in this episode, the neuroscience of depression and how to beat the blues. I've given you lots of tips around what you can do. Ultimately, it's up to the individual to find what works for them. So if the tips I shared with you today doesn't resonate with you, then seek help, seek further help. Okay. As I said, need to bring the support up in order to meet all your life's challenges that you're experiencing. So seek help if this hasn't resonated with you today. And as I said, everyone is unique and special. And so this will resonate with some people. Some people are receptive to receiving this because they're in a state of mind to be receptive to receive this information. If you're not in a state of mind to receive this information, then you could say that was pretty unhelpful, Anthony. Well, then seek help that's going to be helpful for you. And it might be just reaching out to a friend or a family member. So please seek help if this hasn't been helpful for you. And until next time, keep healthy and keep healthing up. Join the Me and My Health Up Club. It would be great to have you as a member. The membership base is expanding. We're becoming a wonderful community, and I provide additional insight beyond the podcast and to help this community grow and to be healthier. So I'm sharing lots more additional insights to really help people along in their journey for an ultimate what they want to achieve, and just providing the right education and support for them to achieve their goals. And until next time, really keep healthing up and look forward to sharing some more insight on the next episode of Me and My Health Up. Podcast disclaimer. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or professional advice and are provided for general information purposes only. All care is taken in the preparation of the information in this podcast. Connected Wellness Proprietary Limited, operating under the brand Me and My Health Up, does not make any representations or give any warranties about its accuracy, reliability, completeness, or suitability for any particular purpose. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it are not to be used as a substitute for professional, medical, psychological, psychiatric, or any other mental health care or healthcare in general. Me and My Health Up recommends you seek the advice of a doctor or qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Inform your doctor of any changes that you may to your lifestyle and discuss these with your doctor. Do not disregard medical advice or delay visiting a medical professional because of something you hear in this podcast. This podcast has been carefully prepared on the basis of current information. Changes in circumstances after publication may affect the accuracy of this information. To the maximum extent permitted by the law, Me and My Health Up disclaims any such representations or warranties to the completeness, accuracy, merchantability, or fitness for purpose of this podcast and will not be liable for any expenses, losses, damages incurred, indirect or consequential damages or costs that may be incurred as a result of the information being inaccurate or incomplete in any way and for any reason. No part of this podcast can be reproduced, redistributed, published, copied, or duplicated in a form without prior permission of Me and My Health Up.